Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about intergroup contact and reduction of bias, branching off of what we discussed last week with the contact hypothesis, and we'll think a bit on the context of gender. Okay, so the chapter begins describing how a female veteran feels invisible in this identity. And I love how this captures the layers of social identity, the gender, and the military, and how they can shift in their salience. I also love that it captures how everyone gives into the construal step in that road to bias that we've talked about. For instance, even the author writes, yet the military from the Pentagon to the troops on the ground has been slow to recognize the service these women perform, even to see them as real soldiers. And says everyone actually in the statement. And whenever people do that about groups of people, that's a construal. It's almost never true that everyone in a group would act the same way, and especially not that they'd think the same way. And how could we even measure that, know that for sure? So I love that about the chapter. It captures all of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the psychological salience of gender. Described on page 30, this is the idea that it's not as simple as thinking that men and women talk differently. Men talk this way, women talk that way, but it's much more accurate to recognize that when gender is salient, when that identity is primed in us, we can change the way that we talk and the way that we interpret other people's talk. This is why an intergroup perspective is different from how many people address communication differences in men's and women's language. It's not as stagnant as we might think or test. And your chapter gives some great examples of this. So the next thing I want to talk about is this quotation, when gender is salient, people conform to their prototypes, and it's on page 32. We've talked about prototypes already, but here we see that when gender is on people's radar, which is another way of thinking about salience, and this chapter overviews Palomares' 3 ways in which this happens, which, if this is too micro for you right now, just remember that salience is about an identity playing an important role in the interaction, and the interactants viewing self and or other in terms of their gender category. Anyway, when gender is salient, then this is an intergroup encounter rather than a personal or interpersonal one. And what happens is that people do the following. First, they behave in more stereotypical ways. And second, and I shouldn't say first and second, they don't necessarily go in an order, but these are 2 things that they do. One thing is that they behave in stereotypical ways, and another thing is that they more heavily interpret others' behavior in relation to their stereotypes. So an example of the first of these is that a woman might talk about emotions more when gender salience is high. And for the second of these, the male interacting with her might see her as a normal female in a highly gender salient context because she's so close to his prototype, that woman who's always talking about her feelings. In a very different example, to use qualifiers such as, I think that, or that's the right answer, isn't it? So qualifiers, rather than just stating the answer, that's the right answer, I think this. Our behaviors that are seen more, these are all behaviors that are seen more among women than among men. So we see that, but when men, to them, are in high gender salient interaction, they are guarded worse than when gender salience is low. Because when we're thinking of people as man or as a woman instead of as a person, we're going to put way more emphasis on difference than what is empirically true. So that's really important to keep in mind. And that's why you'll notice whenever I teach about gender differences in my classes, I always, for sex differences in particular, gender differences, I always have to say to them, remember that there is a lot of overlap between men and women. There's a lot of overlap. And so when I say that men do this more or less than women, it doesn't mean that every man does it more than every woman. There may be many women who do it more than men, or vice versa, whatever the trend is. But it's so easy for us to just put them in those categories and go with it, and then to react accordingly because we want to keep our stereotypes. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, gender stereotypes in virtual worlds. Just a few words about the studies on gaming and gender. Isn't it fascinating that men and women take on the likeness of characters in video games and then they behave in stereotypical ways? This shows how we really think that being a man or woman makes people act differently, dramatically differently. Otherwise, we just act the same, no matter what our character's gender. If we played a male character, played a female character, we just behave the same way online, do the same behaviors, but we don't. I want to point out here that though media is not the focus of this course, people tend to play online the same way they do in real life. Also, the same let's get super stereotypical effects happen when with other social categories too. Wherein, for an older person, online we tend to just act like really, really old, like we think old people are, and all kinds of other social groups, different races, all kinds of things. But what you might find incredibly interesting is that playing these games as a female can even influence thoughts and behaviors after a video game. And they don't talk about that much in this chapter. So for instance, behaving more confidently after we play a tall person, see that effect, that's a really positive thing. But we've seen for gender that when people play as female characters, particularly one that's scantily clad, dressed in a revealing way, after they play the game as that person, they tend to buy into rape myths, believe in the myths that surround rape more than when they don't play those characters. So yes, the salience of gender and even other social identities, like I said, age and race, shift easily, but we can have some carryover when we've been sort of in the body of someone that we stereotype. We take on that role and it stays with us for a little bit. Okay, because I think it's useful for where we are right now in the course, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that which is covered on page 36 and 37, the competing theories, explanations, etc., though I'm happy to talk about and answer questions about this stuff. Instead, I want to talk to you about an extension of last week's gab about the contact hypothesis. Today we're going to talk about the common in-group identity model and the optimal intergroup contact model. Here goes. So, the importance of maintaining subordinate group membership. Oh, I'm so sorry. Skipped ahead. Now we're going to talk about the common in-group model. We're going to talk about the importance of two things. The importance of a common superordinate group membership, and then the importance of maintaining the subordinate group membership. So the first of these, the common superordinate group membership. We'll talk about these in relation to each other, but what I'd like you to write here is that with this, we have the benefits of an in-group interpersonal dynamic. With this, we have benefits of an in-group interpersonal dynamic. Remember, that's where we see each other as similar. You're in my in-group. I like you. I will allocate resources to you. That's week 1 stuff. Now, this importance of maintaining subordinate group memberships. The common in-group model says that this is also important. And this is where we're recognizing those tenets of social identity theory, that who we are in our social groups, the social groups to which we belong to, give us our self-esteem. So common in-group identity model recognizes the importance of both of these. Common in-group identity model essentially says we can take two different groups, two outgroups, and we can put them together in such a way that they have one common identity, or often called a dual identity, that unites these two groups, and also maintain each of their groups' unique social identities. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. So you have that down for each of those, the importance of common superordinate and the importance of maintaining the subordinate. So with common in-group identity model, we recognize that people maintain value from their social identities, like I said. That's Tosh Fonterno's social identity theory that we talked about early on the semester. Also, we recognize that people's views of others are based on these, and that people like each other more when they perceive each other as group members. We've talked about that before, as in-group members. Remember that in the contact hypothesis, people meet outgroup members and like that person, and they transfer that to the entire outgroup. Well, that's likely happening is that they watch, speak with, learn from that outgroup member, and they come to see him or her in a more interpersonal as opposed to intergroup way. But what if in doing so, what if when we meet someone under the contact hypothesis, we meet someone from the outgroup, we meet them, we get to like them, we get to know them as a person, what if when I do that, I try not to be nasty necessarily, but I strip them of their outgroup identity? In other words, what if when I as a woman meet a man and say, Johannes is so interesting, compassionate, smart, dynamic, charismatic, I just think of him as a person. I don't even think of him as a man. Now, if it's played out this way and Johannes heard that, he'd probably be somewhat happy because I did compliment him, but also feel a little put off, right? I mean, can't blame him. Just like I would be put off if I heard him say, oh, Christy's a really great person. Talking to her, I realize she's done a lot of great things. She's fun and kind. She wants to grow as a person. I don't even think of her as a woman. So we're stripping each other of our unique social identities. The model, the common and group identity model, says that we can preserve both of these things, that we can have a dual identity. So they thought, why can't we just do this in which we keep the original group identities and we also have this overarching context of a superordinate identity? So here's a very simplified version of their model. The mediators. First, what they want to do is they wanted to test the different ways that we might think about these groups. So they said that here's what can happen. Under the first condition, letter A, we have separate individuals. So in this case, it would be Christy and Johannes. And we get benefits from that. Christy and Johannes, a man and a woman talking to each other, they like each other. This increases how both of them feel about each other and a little bit the whole group. Contact hypothesis, okay? Then we have a one group recategorization. We, for instance, as players on the same team, a sport team or a work team, we work together. This gives the benefit of our shared identity becoming salient and making us feel closer together. Think about us all in our jerseys. You know, it's as if now we have a new identity that works the way that Tajfel and Turner describe. We like each other, we do things for each other, etc. Because we don't see each other. These mediators are all about conceptualization. We don't see each other as Christy and Johannes. We see each other, or even as a boy and a girl, we are just seeing each other. We're just primed to think of each other as on the Jets sports team or Steelers fans, whatever it is. Letter C is the two-group categorization. This example of this would be men talking with women. So here we keep it salient that you're from the men's group and I'm from the women's group. And the benefits, at least they're together. So you're going to have that benefit of their spending time together, sharing things. But under common and group identity model, we see that there aren't enormous benefits because what happens here is that even though we're spending time together, we are thinking of each other as the men's group and the women's group. And so we are going to do that whole construal thing where we think about things that make us different. An exaggerated example, of course, of this is men and women getting together a Friday night and playing that Battle of the Sexes game. It really primes us, and they're spending time together. It primes us to thinking about each other as the men's group, the women's group. Okay. And much of what this chapter and my examples are about. Now the last one, two subgroups within a broader group. You know where I'm going with this. This one tends to have the best benefits. And this is where we put people in scenarios where you've got a male and a female players, for instance, who are all mountaineers. And you talk about, you mention that, oh, the male females, the female players, not one is better than the others. And part of what keeps that from getting too competitive is that simultaneously in the same broader communication climate, you're also talking about how they're all on the same team. So for instance, we could talk about all being mountaineers as MA corporate students, or either of those two labels or both of those together. That would be our subordinate group. But we also talk about the subgroups within us, and male, female could be just one of those subgroups that we could celebrate. It's the best one. It's the one that makes people the happiest. Okay, so those are the four mediators of contact. They're the way that we, when we're in contact, think about each other. The next part of their model was this conditions of contact. And these are the things that precede the contact, and they're important in terms of the precursors to how well this contact with each other is going to work. The authors of Common and Group Identity Model acknowledge that the conditions put forth by Allport and others, cooperation rather than competition, the common goal, positive pre-contact, which is something that was implied by Allport but we haven't talked about before, support from authorities and norms, thought that all of those that we talked about last week, that they would be potentially beneficial precursors to how well this contact, the real contact, would actually work. It turns out that they do. They do tend to help. But some consequences, consequences is a negative sounding word. You've got the conditions that come first, then the mediators, which are the heart of the model, which is why I mentioned them first, and then the consequences, which are the outcomes. Consequences is a negative sounding word. I have kids, which you're primed to think about because my baby monitor is on. But the conditions put forth, so this consequence of it is that, which is what we say for kids all the time when they're in trouble, it's really not negative at all. We see that there are cognitive effects, which are where the cognitive part is that we think about groups more positively. The affective components like empathy and then also behavioral effects of helping behaviors, which are all things what we've talked about before. So again, we see that when those conditions are put forth, things go better for contact, more cognitive, affective, and behavioral positive outcomes, pro-social outcomes. Then we have the mediators, the separate individuals, one group categorization, two group categorization, and two subgroups within a broader group. All of these are effective, but they increase in their effectiveness in different ways. In particular, they, from A to D, each one they're strengthened, with A and D, they're strengthened to the greatest in terms of promoting quality relationships that make everyone really happy. And then we see those consequences. So lots of great research on this, and it consistently shows, again, I keep saying it, but I really want to drive it home, that having an all-encompassing group membership like Mountaineers, people that work together in a work group at the office, family members of many other dual identities, or using the theories titled this common in-group, these are all going to be happier. You're going to have happier group members. They're happier with each other, they help each other, and they get some personal satisfaction of being in that shared group. So if you create this common identity and you forget about the subordinate identities, you strip people of something important. Because, and I can't stress this enough, we see that when people say things like, it's our big groups that matter, they tend to see that other social group as part of them. But they don't really accept, appreciate, and acknowledge that other social group as something important on its own. As we discussed at onset, our social identities are a big part of who we are. So when we ignore people's identities, when we're part of one group, we meet someone from an out-group, and in getting to know them, we just think about them more like us. We pull them over to us. We ignore, we shut out their social group. And that's a big part of who they are, so ignoring them, it hurts them. It's no surprise then that intergroup scholars are not a fan of the colorblind approach that refers to skin color but can be applied to other group memberships. While the statement that we can be colorblind because race doesn't matter may come from a place of wanting to look at people as individuals, it is harmful. None of us like it when we are told our social groups don't matter. That's what good empirical research shows and what you probably know as smart people. And why can't we have our different social memberships and still be a part of something bigger together? Why not? In other words, if Johannes and I, he's a man, I'm a woman, are on a team at work, why can't he appreciate me as a person and as a woman and also see me as a valuable member of his in-group on this work team? Saying that I'm a valuable woman doesn't mean that he's not a valuable man or that I'm not a good part of the work team and vice versa. It may not surprise you to know that achieving these goals is consistently done through two types of communication. It isn't just these two types, but these are two biggies. These are two go-tos. We can actually do this. We can maintain people's subordinate identities and have that superordinate identities. It's the best of both worlds, and it can be done. Okay, so communication. This is the next big bold point here. Communication that feeds dual identity or common in-group identity. How do we develop this? Well, how do we feed both of our both needs? First, we have self-disclosure. Self-disclosure for the intergroup scholar is a great thing. Now, we know from the interpersonal realm that self-disclosures, when we tell things about ourselves that people don't already know, we often are interested in the really interesting, exciting, maybe even dark and dirty, and not everybody knows parts of self-disclosure. They're fascinating. But self-disclosure is just sharing things about who you are, positive, negative, just getting people into the real you. And so it can be messy. Self-disclosure can be a messy process, and it may even get dark, but it brings us together. And so because of that, self-disclosure is a great way to tap into a dual identity, because as people talk, they're going to talk about things that are similar to you, make you think about them as a common in-group member, and they're going to talk about things that are unique to them, that are different from you, and that maybe even tap into their other social identities. So self-disclosure can really tie in nicely with that subordinate and the subordinate. The second behavior is accommodative behaviors, which we aren't going to go in depth about communication and accommodation theory, but that word accommodative comes from that theory. I'll give you some examples of accommodative communication. So, great ones for the intergroup context are when we ask questions. That's a great example of accommodative behavior. When we actually ask people open-ended questions about the social groups to which they belong and about their just personal experiences. When we show interest, when they answer the questions that we ask, and we demonstrate nonverbally and verbally that we are interested by asking follow-up questions or saying, that's really interesting, and being in tune and referencing back to things that they've said. And when we acknowledge who people are, when we say things to them about, oh, since you belong to that group, not everything that we say is about, oh, you're a woman, you're a woman, you're a woman, you're a woman. But from time to time, we acknowledge you're a woman, or you're a man, or you're black or white, or you're from the South, or you are a heart scientist, or you're a social scientist. I study this a lot in in-law relationships. It's amazingly simple. When mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, who are often dramatized for being from totally different worlds and butting heads, but they really don't as much empirically as people think. When mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, for instance, say things like, you're a part of our family now. And they say, I'd love to learn how your family of origin celebrated the holidays. What's important? What can we do to bring that into our shared rituals when you come here to celebrate in this household? All of these things are feeding into both of those identities. They're significantly improving how much these women think positively about each other, how much they feel welcomed and valued, and how they express strong intentions for maintaining their relationship over the long haul, no matter what, and for extending resources to each other in the future. Conversely, when women don't do these things with their daughters-in-law or their mothers-in-law, they don't connect this way. They may even be satisfied. They may say, I don't want connection with my mother-in-law, and I'm fine with that. Okay, that may not be horrible, but if you never ask her about her family of origin, or you never welcome in her rituals, and you never say, I'd love to bring you into our rituals. Here, be a part of it. Hear the story and look and make eye contact and take family pictures together and do all of those things. You don't get the richness of that relationship, and you don't get to know each other and fulfill each other the way that you could. So, no matter what, over the long haul, good communication, good self-disclosure, sometimes even bad self-disclosure, and good accommodation, they really work. It's not the big gestures either. It's not the grandiose things, making a big production out of it. It's the day-to-day messages that create a culture that says your unique memberships are important and you are an important part of our shared group membership. So there are many other models that we could get to, but we don't have time for them. In addition to reflecting on this common in-group identity model and its components, the preceding elements of contact, which are less important, the most important part, because we've talked about most of this already with the contact hypothesis, the really central part of common in-group identity model, which are those four mediators, and of course emphasizing, oh my gosh, you're tired of me talking about it, that the dual membership is best. That there's some benefits to the others for sure, but you get the most if you really work to achieve both of those, the sub and the superordinate identities. Anyway, focusing on those, I'd love for you in your assignment to think about gender salient communication in the activity, which references the ever popular and also ever so unempirically supported book, Men Are from Mars and Women Are from Venus. Don't get mad. I know a lot of people love this book, but do they love it because it tells them the truth, or just that kernel of truth, stereotypes, and how we think and behave? I can't wait to read what you say and write on this. Thanks, everybody. See me with questions.